Do fitness professionals have higher levels of disordered eating? That is what we're going to dive into today. There is a new systematic review that came out in October 2025, and I'm excited to dive into what is important, what is relevant, and tease out some of the nuance that came from this study. And I'm really excited to dive into it because it is a systematic review, and systematic reviews are fantastic because it gathers a lot of different data sets. However, there are some downsides, which we will cover as well. If you guys were OG listeners to my old YouTube channel, throwback to that, I used to do a segment called Science Simplified, where I would take a research paper and I would break it down and really just share the practical tidbits, jewels, messages that everybody could use. Because let's be honest, most research articles are very inaccessible in the sense they talk about a lot of different things that maybe aren't relevant for most people or really matter for most people. They also have their own language and just way of sharing things. Obviously, the stats, pretty boring, pretty dry. This paper was very well written, but some papers, I mean, it is like pulling teeth to get the message. And then also, some papers can actually be literally inaccessible unless you just have lots of money to spare, because if you're not a part of an institution or the article is free and open access, it is very pricey. So while I am in school and a part of the USF network, I am downloading lots of studies. So excited to dive into this today. But first, welcome back to Undefined. I'm Lauren Conlon. I've been a nutrition coach and educator in the space for the past 12 years, and I'm also in my second year of schooling to become a therapist. And I call this a variety show. Basically, we touch on physical health, mental health, research, things that are happening with my clients, just things that I want to talk about, and really just cover a lot of different topics here at Undefined. So I'm very excited for today because, like I said, this has been something I've done previously. And to be honest, this show reminds me a lot of how I used to do my just like sit down chit chat YouTube videos. So anyways, let's dive into it. First, I want to cover what a systematic review is for everyone. So basically, when you're reading a study that just says, hey, here's what we did, that is generally one data set, one intervention. And what happens with the systematic review is they go through a whole lengthy process, which I'm not going to explain here, but basically they create in a database, okay, these are the types of studies that we want. This is the inclusion criteria that we want. This is what's going to exclude studies. And they're able to gather a lot of different pools of data sets. So for this specifically, there was, I believe they said 9 unique data sets, because there were some actually that had an overlap. So there was like 14. When you really read it, it was like 9 unique data sets. And I think there was like 3,200 participants. So one of the great benefits of a systematic review is that you're taking a lot of different studies at different time points that still fit within this criteria. And now you're getting a lot more people, and that is going to strengthen the evidence for or against something. Now, a downside with this is that, of course, you can have a broad umbrella term like fitness professional, and that's going to mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. And in this study in particular, they opened it up to different countries. I believe there was like 5 or 6 different countries, which is great on one hand because it makes it more, inclusive and more, what is the word I'm looking for? I want to say worldwide, Mr. Worldwide. It makes it broader, the implications. Of course, it's not every country in the world, but it's still more than just one country. So you can say, okay, our results are broader reaching, but also the drawback there is that different countries, those terms, and in this case, again, fitness professional, are going to look different. Even what somebody would consider disordered eating is going to look very different country to country, and in our case, in the US, like state to state. So in any case, there are some obvious pros of doing systematic reviews, and there are some cons, but that's really everything in research. Like, if there is a pro, there is going to be a con in some way, and that's why having a lot of different research and evidence is important before you can make a justification for something. And in my mind, when you think of like evidence-based anything, evidence-based practices, you're not just looking at one thing. Oh, this study said this, must. No, you have to look at the aggregate of the data to really make a more well-informed decision. And of course, in my mind, true evidence-based practice is also not just contingent on research, but also contingent on what you're seeing in real life with yourself and your clients and what your experience tells you. I'm going to read through some of the important parts in the introduction, and here's a little cheat code for you guys. If you are interested in reading more research and you want to find more papers that are similar to the topic that you're reading about, always go to the references that are in the introduction. Like, that is a gold mine. If there's a topic I'm trying to learn more about and I find a good paper, I am looking at their references to see what else I can learn about it, because the introduction for this paper is taking what they find important from this paper, but you could go to this paper and find something equally as important that they found or they wrote about, or another citation. So it's like this fun, I think it's fun, like detective game of like building up your references and resources. So anyways, before I continue to nerd out, disordered eating. Disordered eating encompasses a spectrum of maladaptive eating behaviors ranging from dieting to clinical eating disorders, including binge eating, dietary restriction, purging, and compensatory behaviors carried out to influence shape and weight. Now, what is really important here is to distinguish eating disorders from disordered eating, and I get this question all the time. Eating disorders are very, very specific in the sense of the severity of the symptomology, can't speak today, not good for a podcast, the symptomology, as well as the length of time something has been present. So if you read through the DSM, you can just Google that, like, what are the, defining characteristics of anorexia nervosa? They're very, very specific and they're very, very severe. And what I love about this example, great definition, is eating disorders is a spectrum of maladaptive eating behaviors. So these are things that are more pervasive. They probably show up maybe every day or several times a week, or it's really like a thought pattern behind the types of behaviors, but it's not going to have the same level of severity. So I want everybody to keep that in mind. But you can already see how this is getting a little bit dicey in terms of saying, well, that's going to look very different to every single person. Some other key factors here. Body dissatisfaction is one of the strongest predictors of disordered eating, and psychosocial factors such as following restrictive diets and engaging in appearance-driven or compulsive exercise often stem from or reinforce body dissatisfaction, further elevating the risk of DE development. Okay, makes sense, all checking out so far. A term and a concept that I love that they highlighted in here is called physical capital. I'd actually never heard of this before. I understand the concept, but didn't know it had a name, or maybe they gave it a name, but I'm here for it. Physical capital. So basically what this is saying is that trainers and fitness professionals who are more muscular and leaner and quote unquote look the part are going to be perceived as more knowledgeable and competent versus non-muscular coaches. And this is something where that is going to really, really depend on culture and who you are servicing. So I don't want to say that this is right or wrong, but this is what they found in other literature. What they said here was that the impact of disordered eating extends beyond the individual fitness professional. Fitness professionals are seen as gatekeepers of exercise and nutrition advice and as role models for healthy lifestyle behaviors. And I said, well, this is where things start to get a little trickier. They go on to say fitness professionals with disordered eating may indirectly model behaviors to their clients or encourage clients to engage in potentially deleterious diet and exercise behaviors that they engage in themselves. When I read, just fun fact, I either have to highlight, underline, take notes, and I wrote in here, this is where things get tricky, ... But who determines deleterious? Like, what is the determining factor here? Because, again, if we go back to what they were talking about, that is going to be very, very different depending on who you're talking to, what goals we're talking about, how are they implemented, because a restrictive diet to one person, they might call it a restrictive diet. Another person might call it a flexible diet. what's in a name? So that's where all of this is very, very subjective. And of course, anything that is dealing with eating behaviors and psychology is always going to be subjective. There's really no way around that. Now, when we get to the methods section, I'm going to, spare you guys all the boring details, but like I mentioned in the beginning, 9 papers with unique data sets. So 14 total papers, 19 unique data sets, and a total of 3,257 fitness professionals. But what is a fitness professional per this paper? What they said is that fitness professional is an umbrella term generally used to refer to professionals involved in exercise instruction, prescription, and delivery. Of course, that is very, very broad. So in an attempt to standardize what this would look like, only those with a professional or governing body and a scope of practice, example, personal trainers, were included. They also said that the studies that were used were only ones that had validated disordered eating assessment instruments with specific cutoff scores. So again, nerd speak for they were using different questionnaires that were validated already. Oh, other important things that were in here, I thought were important. 66.6% of the participants were women, and they mentioned that a variety of professions were sampled, and they specifically said personal trainers, gymnastic coaches, elite coaches, and fitness instructors. So already here, can we see how this is getting a little bit more complex? So a lot of people listening might be online coaches themselves, not under a governing body. They were not included, nor do I believe there has been a study done on such individuals. Gymnastic coaches, I guess you could say that they are fitness professionals, but I would not have thought of that had that not been in here. So there's that. And, what is an elite coach? Elite coach could be for a professional sporting team. Elite coach could be the title within a governing body in a different country. So this is where research is fantastic, but we can't hang our hat on everything because we are at the mercy of the data sets that are being used. And like I said, I'm just thinking of over here in the States, especially in the online sector, like no governing body and tons of people who may very likely have disordered eating, but not even are included in here. So just a couple things to, sit and digest on. Now, before we get to the discussion, I want to share a little bit more about these data sets because this is actually where I think we're going to get into the nitty-gritty and see some of these differences. So they have in here the location, profession, age, percentage of women, instrument that they used, and their interpretation. So pretty great table. So love this. So the different countries, US was twice, Sweden, I believe, is twice as well, Australia, UK, Norway is twice, and the Netherlands. So several different countries, however, not representative of course, the entire world, so can't make that argument. But what I think is really cool was that they broke down the profession. So this is where, we can start to see, okay, well, what was actually being looked at in terms of fitness professional. So I will just read them off. Group fitness instructors, personal trainer, high performance coaches. What does that mean? Don't know, but it is a performance coach, not a physique coach. Personal trainers, group fitness instructor, gymnastic coaches. Again, really confused about the gymnastic coaches being added in here, but in any case, maybe I'm the only one who just didn't think of that. Let me know in the comments. Fitness instructor, group fitness instructor, personal trainer, group fitness instructor, coaches, just blanket coaches, personal trainers, group fitness instructors, and then elite sport coaches. So in both of the data sets that focused on performance and sport, none of the coaches reported disordered eating or eating disorders, which that makes sense because in general, regardless of country, and both of these were outside of the US, regardless of country, most people who are focused on performance are thinking in terms of that. What is going to improve our performance? Now, certainly there are some athletes who struggle more, and maybe that is why they added in gymnastics as an example, where the performance is at a peak, as well as there is a certain expectation for physique. It's not going to be the same, of course, as like bodybuilding or something like that, but interesting, no bodybuilding on here, which there's no real governing body that is well accepted, so makes sense. Oh, another note that I wrote was in Norway, the drive for muscularity was stronger amongst male instructors, but both sexes experienced a similar high drive for leanness. So this is also where you start to see some more of these details coming out. So looking at the discussion, they did find that disordered eating prevalence was fairly common amongst fitness professionals. And in here they said, especially group fitness instructors and personal trainers. And one thing, and I really, really love this, is what they said, our findings in light of the generally poor baseline levels of ED and mental health literacy amongst coaches are of concern and may also adversely affect clients through modeling and normalizing of disordered eating practices and exercise environments. And that's really the reason why this is of concern. If a fitness professional themselves is dealing with disordered eating, maybe even an eating disorder, and they're passing on their knowledge and advice to others, could this be making this worse? This is always going to be the challenge, where who is deciding what is good, bad, deleterious, to use their word. It is very, very nuanced and complex, but based on what we're seeing, there is definitely a prevalence here, and the possibility of individuals, transmuting some of that is certainly there. Now, the other thing, and they talk about it in here, is a lot of these measurements aren't always the best for athletic populations. And like as an example, the EAI, the exercise addiction inventory, that may not actually reflect dysfunctional attitudes amongst individuals who are active, because that is going to be very different in an athletically minded population versus someone who is more of like a lifestyle gen pop. And to kind of take a bigger step back, this is why it's really hard to use certain assessments. And even in my first research study that I did with Dr. Campbell back in 2015, when we were doing our dieting study on IFYM versus flexible dieting, I wanted to use an assessment that looked at eating behaviors, but wasn't trying to find an eating disorder. And a lot of the assessments do that. And this has also been a struggle too with like any kind of physique athlete research, because it's like, if you ask some of these questions, like, of course the answer is yes, because this is my sport, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that person has an eating disorder. They might, but they might not. And it's also important, like, when are you asking this? So there's so much nuance. And honestly, when I did this current research study that we just finished, I created my own subscale, my own, survey, because I was like, I really don't want to use anything that's validated. Now, that means that my results are going to be less strong, would be probably the easiest way of thinking about it. And I would say less respected, but it's just not going to be the same thing versus, we know certain assessments measure things pretty clearly for certain individuals, but athletic minded people, even if they're not necessarily athletes, like the sense of they're like competing in something, it can still be a challenge to use some of these assessments that are in there. Now, another point I want to mention that was so great that they added in the discussion was that they said only one study used clinical interviews, which are considered the gold standard for assessing eating pathology. Absolutely. However, this study was conducted in a psychiatric facility, meaning it is likely to overestimate ED symptoms relative to the general population. If somebody is already in a psychiatric unit, that means things have really escalated for them. So while we had, on one hand, the gold standard of examining their eating behaviors, we also had the reality of their situation. So this is where reading papers, like actually going through the paper, is so, so important, because just going through the abstract is not going to give all of these details. Now, I love a good abstract. Certainly have to use that as the launching point, because if you read the abstract and it's either not interesting or you don't want to check it out, of course, you're not going to read the entire paper, but you're really going to find some nuggets in here, especially I find in the intro and the discussion. Like, those are always my two favorite parts to get the whole kind of holistic view of everything. And, who really likes reading stats? I don't. That is for sure. In conclusion, they found that personal trainers had the highest rates of disordered eating and performance coaches had the lowest rates in this data set. And that makes a lot of sense. We've already talked about how performance coaches typically view performance as number one because that is their role. And so things like physique and really everything else comes secondary to performance. So it makes a lot of sense to me. And also, they brought up that concept of physical capita or capital, kind of like that idea of like your body is your business card, this is your billboard, and how personal trainers certainly would be most influenced by that, because if someone is looking at a personal trainer and they're saying, I aspire to look like this, they would potentially want to hire someone that looks that way. Whether that is right, wrong, indifferent, doesn't matter. That does exist. Now, that is going to be strongly driven by culture, where someone lives, and the type of client that coach is trying to attract. Because there are plenty of examples of fantastic trainers and coaches who look nothing like the client archetype that they are trying to work with or do work with. Like, I can think of some of the top bodybuilding coaches who just look like regular people. Like, they're in shape, but they're not also winning the Olympia. And there's also plenty of personal trainers who maybe they're big meatheads, but they train more Gen Pop moms. And they're great because they have a physique that some people might aspire to, but more importantly, they're great at training. And there's so many things that make a good personal trainer, not just look. So, anyways, I feel like this paper brought up a lot of good points. Some of the data wasn't super strong, mostly just because fitness professional is such a broad term. And this paper did a fantastic job. Credit to the authors of showing, hey, here are some of our limitations. But I really want to close out with what this was all about, and love this. Chef's kiss. Perfect ending sentence. If future high quality research corroborates high levels of disordered eating amongst fitness professionals, this should be addressed by appropriate screening and education in professional certifications that emphasize mental health and ED literacy and provide fitness professionals with the tools and knowledge to refer out to appropriate professionals when required. Yes, 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 yes. Love this. And ultimately, this is what this paper is all about. It is simply highlighting, hey, looks like there's more disordered eating in this space. If this actually is the case, then these professional certifications should be doing a better job of educating coaches on this. And spoiler alert, I don't think we need another paper to highlight the fact that yes, they definitely do. And what's really interesting now, my mind is like, oh, I would love to do a study on online fitness coaches. Of course, having to create an inclusion criteria of what that means, what that looks like. But this would be so interesting to do because they weren't even, brought up in this because there is no accrediting body. That would make things less I hate this word, less generalizable data without something like a governing body. However, I feel like it would be so interesting. But I think I am tapped out on surveys. Let me know if you guys enjoyed this format of the show. I really like doing these, so hopefully it's a resounding yes. Even if not, I'm probably going to do them, but let me know if you did enjoy this, or I guess if there was anything else that you would like me to cover in here, or if there are certain papers or topics that you guys want me to cover that are in the literature. I can find hopefully a solid paper or two and go from there. So thank you all so much for listening. And there was something else I wanted to add. Not going to remember it. All good. If I remember, I will add it to next week's episode. So thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think, and I will talk to y'all next week.